Hey folks, so it's been a minute since I've done any kind of educational content on this channel, but educational content is what this channel has always meant to be for or something. A lot of it has gone into writing lately, which, is sort of the way I prefer to communicate my ideas anyway, because it gives me time to think through them and be clear and revise. But I do miss making educational videos. So this weekend I got an email from someone who had been working through Tarot on Earth, which was my first book, and they asked about the way I'd done the court cards in that video. And they just asked for some feedback on what they were doing, and I realized it's been a minute since I looked at how I did the courts in that book, because even in the short time since I wrote it, it's my methods have evolved really a lot. And I don't think there's anything wrong in particular with the way that I wrote them in Tarot on Earth. It's just that I have changed and I've evolved. And I think we all should, you know what I mean? So I think what I wrote at that point was what I was doing. What I'm doing now has evolved from that. It came from that. So it's not like it's bad. It's just that I keep experimenting and exploring. And so what I wanted to do was make a quick video, by my standards, about how I read the courts today, how you can read the courts today, and just plug, once again, my new book, Your Tarot Toolkit. And this is covered in that book, and there are activities that go along with it. So here's the thing. I think in Tarot on Earth, I did a pretty traditional thing of trying to think of the court cards as embodiments of famous people or archetypes or characters in history. And that comes from, there's a huge tradition of doing that, but it also comes from a tradition of sort of identifying ourselves as one of the courts. And I don't actually think that helps as much as I thought it did back then. What I think it does is it kind of reduces us and the court cards in a way that I think is reductive. And not that, again, it's not bad. I just think there are better ways to do it now. So here's the system that I'm working with now and that I teach now. And, you can see it in practice in the book. Not to, be that person. But so here's the thing. Each of the ranks of the courts represents a job. Now, one of the struggles that we have as tarot readers today is that the courts are very gendered and they're very European and they're very royalist. Now, and when I teach this, I work with the titles as they are, but you don't have to. You can substitute the titles, the jobs for each of the courts for something modern, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. You can still work with whatever deck you want and just know in your head that, like, say the queen is the CEO, for example. But just to make sense of this, we'll go with the standard titles. But again, you can subvert those in your own way however you want to. So each of the ranks has a job, and we start with that job. And there are responsibilities, excuse me, there are responsibilities and tasks that are part of that job. So we take the page, right? The page has a very specific job. I'm not going to do all your homework for you, but what I recommend is that you actually go to primary sources like the dictionary or encyclopedias, and you look at what the job description is from the very beginning of its origins as a title, as a thing. So you think about what a page is and does, and you just sort of list all of that out, and then you can also think of correlations between that job and others in time. So I think of the page often as a squire, too, not just sort of a messenger, but also a knight in training, for example. So you can draw little lines between that world, the page, and adjacent things in history. And that's sort of the first step of it. And then the second step of that is actually draw a line between that job and modern life. So pages actually still exist. If you're an intern at NBC, they call you a page. But like an intern is a good example of someone who might be kind of pagey in life. You know what I mean? But there are others, right? And so you start to connect that old-fashioned job to modern roles and responsibilities in the world. Students, for example, pages are often associated with students, and I think that that is a really good way to think about it too. Right. So, step one is to think about what the literal job description is of the court rank. Then you think about what their jobs and responsibilities are, and then you draw a line between that job and modern life, right? So you can do that pretty easily and pretty quickly, even just sort of Googling. If you don't want to deal with primary source material, you can certainly do Wikipedia here too. It's not like this is a thesis that needs to be defended. It's just for you. I do tend to think of the pages principally as students, but also as servants. And so now the second step comes along, which is to think about their temperament, or to think about their tendencies, or before we get to tendencies, actually, their worldview. So their job and who they are and their place in society impacts their worldview. So if I think about the pages as students and servants, that's going to shape how they're likely to think about the world. And it could, there's obviously no one is any one thing, right? So a page could think of many different things about the world. But I know just from being in the world, I know from history and my own perceptions, right, that servants might have certain worldviews. All you have to do is watch Downton Abbey to get sort of one idealized version of the servant's worldview, right? You get that sort of like, it's an honor to serve these rich-ass old white people. But of course, there's another view of servanthood, which is that it's a shitty thing to have to spend your waking hours serving someone else. And certainly you could also get really political with this. Absolutely. You know what I mean? So if you want to dig into colonization and all of that, then there's going to be a huge amount that you could mine for the ranks in the court cards. So it's going to shape your worldview, the rank's worldview, their lot in life, so to speak. So I tend to think of this pages in some cases as very dutiful, very goal oriented, very deferential, but also resentful and aware of their lot in life, right? Because they are at the bottom of the food chain in terms of rank. So that will shape their worldview. That's their worldview. From there, you think about the things they're likely to behave, the ways they're likely to behave as a result of that worldview. So what qualities might they exhibit, or might they be prone to demonstrate living in the world as they do? Students can be very curious, they can be petulant, they can be childish, they can be excited, they can be rambunctious. Servants can be dutiful, they can be resentful, they can be political and class conscious. And so all of these things are things they're likely to do or behave like. And then finally, the third part is you associate it then with their element. So if a page of cups exists, that page is probably going to be more idealistic than, say, the page of swords. The page of cups is probably going to be a little bit more like the housekeeper and the butler on Downton Abbey, right? Because cups, idealism. Where the swords I always think of is going to be much more sort of revolutionary, much more aware of the status, much more aware of the class situation. And so they're going to maybe have a more revolutionary or more resentful point of view. And so you think about the way the element then impacts the behavior. And that sort of gives you the court meaning. Now, I think of the courts as doers. I think that they are people, they're verbs. And so I tend to look at them as ways they behave, or, tendencies that they have, but also, maybe advice for how to achieve something or how not to achieve something. So you can read the courts in terms of, how someone is behaving in a reading, and then how you may want to act, or what qualities you may want to embody. Now, I very firmly believe that we contain all the courts in us at all times. Which one of us might be more activated at any given time is going to depend on who we're with and what we're doing, how our mood is that day, etc. And so in a video like this, I'm going to be more sort of Queen of Swordsy as a teacher then, you know, in a few minutes when I have to go into a meeting and I'm going to have to be like more Page of Wandsy because I'm going to have to like get people passionate about fixing a problem, right? So that's just an example, but I think that's one helpful way to think about us and to think about the courts and how we interpret them is they're not a significator of one person, they're a significator of a mood or a tendency that we have at a given time based on the context that we're living in at that moment. You know, so you can be the Queen of Cups in your marriage during dinner and the King of Swords in a fight after dinner, and then your mom calls and you're suddenly the Page of Pentacles. You know, so your context shifts, and as your context shifts, so does your court rank, your court element. You, as a person, are embodying different court like elements, if that makes sense. And one thing I like to do in readings to figure out who the court card represents is to think about the context of the question. So if the question is something like, you know, how do I get my mom to stop driving at night because her vision is bad? And I get the Queen of Swords, the Ten of Wands, and the, I don't know, the Hierophant. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what the court is doing contextually, where they're looking, what they're looking at. And I already can't remember what chord I said, right? But like Queen of Wands is looking at the Ten of Wands and the Hierophant, and I see the Queen of Wands is really enthusiastic about this because of Wands, but I also see that burden of the Ten, and then the Hierophant as this sort of tradition, as this thing that has always been. And so I start to see the Queen of Wands now as the querent who has this sort of obstacle toward history. So the Queen of Wands is the querent who's seeing this conversation with their mother and the sort of entrenchment of the Hierophant, right? Like, that's just an example, and obviously it's much easier in a real reading. But you can sort of see how the Queen is behaving based on the other cards around it to figure out who's who. And then from there, you use the qualities that we talked about, that you extrapolated from the work that you did on exploring, you know, what a queen's job is. Now, the queen and the king are really interesting because, in essence, their job is the same if you're thinking about the queen as something more than a royal uterus, which I encourage you to do. Because I don't think it's incredibly modern to look at really the empress and the queens in that way. You know, I think that you want to look at them as leaders because that's what they are. I think you then place the queens in context either in a new role, so you recast the queen as something like a CEO or something, you know what I mean, Kamala, or you then think about the historical boundaries that a queen existed within. So like if you think about Queen Elizabeth I, right, she wasn't born to the job, so she had to learn how to do it, and she had to learn how to do it in a world of men who thought she couldn't do it, you know. And so you think about queens as someone who has to run a country and everyone's against them, and they still have to be effective, so they have to like get creative, and they have to be good at negotiating, and they have to be good at navigating the patriarchy, right? So you can sort of dig into the historical as well as the modern and think about how the queen is different from the king, even though ostensibly their job is the same, because the queen is doing it under different circumstances than the king, whereas the king was born to the job and so trained to do it, and so probably feeling entitled and smug, and, you know, so the qualities and the worldview of those two cards are going to be different if you stay with the historical. If you go with something modern, then you kind of get to choose whatever you want. It's just important that they be different enough that they fill a role in life and in tarot that you need. The World Spirit Tarot did a nice job of recasting the courts as student, seeker, sibyl, and sage. And I that was what got me thinking about this when that deck came out back in like 2001. It's gone further since, and just like in a general sense, I do think of the queens as leaders contextually, and the kings as leaders contextually. I don't necessarily have like a clean parallel for like, oh, the queen is the CEO and the king is like the president of the board or whatever. Like I don't go that far, because for me, I don't need it, and it's not super helpful to do that. But if you want to do that, I think it can help you understand how they are likely to see the world and how they are likely to behave as a result of it. So a CEO is definitely going to see the world differently than a senior manager down the line. Um, I tend to think of the pages, like I said, as students and servants. I think of the knights as servants and hunters, but also teachers, right? Because they are the mentor to the page. And then I talked about the queen and the king, and that they are sort of in charge, but the way they're in charge is in different contexts. So, but again, it's up to you. You can make it like student, hunter, facilitator, and master, or something like that. It's helpful to think of non-gendered and fairly neutral terms for each of them. And I guess finally, that's the other thing, is neutrality. So as you're considering the worldview and the tendencies or the behaviors of the court, you're gonna think of value judgment words, which will tell you that, like I use resentful, for example. And that's where you start. That's always there. But it's helpful to then sort of, as you brainstorm all of this, reduce it down to neutral words, so that you just have those neutralities in your head. Because there are times where a page is going to be petulant and resentful. There are times where they're going to be super helpful and eager and ready to go. You know what I mean? And so if you can kind of keep your keywords in the middle somewhere, that gives you elasticity, which is a thing I talk about a lot, elasticity. You're going to feel like you have more to work with when you lay out the cards. So as I said, there are activities for this in the new book, and it does go through this really well, but you don't need it to do that. You can do what I took you through, which is to like think about the rank, think then about their worldview, think about their tendencies as a result of that worldview, and then how those tendencies come to life within each element. And you can then figure out who's who in a reading as a result of what they're doing, where they're looking, what they're facing, etc., and know then who the court card is. And I don't generally read the courts in any other way. Like, they are always people, whether or not they're the querent or someone else. It depends, again, on context. I know a lot of readers don't read or do third-party readings, or they don't look at the actions of others, or that the courts always kind of represent some aspect of the querent, and that's fine. You can still do that, but I do third-party readings, and I do really truly believe that when the court cards show up, it's worth considering whether they represent someone else in the querent's life, because people outside of our lives have influence on us. It's just, that's unavoidable. So I do take that into consideration a lot, and sometimes it's the querent and sometimes it's not. Again, there's plenty of examples in the book. I don't want to keep shooting it, but I can't cover them all in this video. You can very easily, for $20 US, find all those answers and a lot more in the book. But so that's how my court reading has evolved since, and it's been really influenced by my own experimentation. I think it's been influenced by Camelia Elias's exploration of function. I took her Lenormand courses, and she talks a lot about function in the Lenormand, in terms of the object, like what's the function of the heart, for example. And so that's really been influential on this, and also just sort of understanding that people do influence us. And so it is helpful to have cards that represent other people in our readings. So that is that. I hope this is helpful, and I hope it sort of sparks some creative juices flowing in you. And even if you don't end up doing this, it is kind of super interesting to go back to the essence of the words in tarot, to go back to the Empress, to go back to the Page, to go to Temperance, and say, what are these things in their essence? What is the dictionary meaning of these things? What's the encyclopedia meaning of these things? Because it can kind of unlock tarot in life for you when you kind of strip away all the sort of symbolism, I put in quotes, and the things that we're told, and just kind of go to the essence of the word. It can really open things up for you. So again, I hope this helps. Take care, be good, and hope to make more videos like this in the near days, weeks, months / time. Be good.